Zhou Engong was a protagonist, not just by name, but by an almost pathological need to be in motion. After a brief rattling sound, Zhu Engong entered a store, and the cashier announced his arrival. Zhu Engong, having dealt with this kind of thing his whole life, told the cashier to stop making fun of him, and asked if he had the game he was looking for. The cashier chuckled and said he had saved a copy for him. It was a copy of the Night Saga remake, a game about humans and demons where you could choose to play as either the human hero Locke or the Demon King's eldest son, Zephyr Ragnaros. The game was an adventure around the world, filled with missions to complete. Having beaten the original game more than 10 times, Zhu Engong felt confident in his knowledge. This was also the first game to be released after VR became a thing. When he arrived home, he plugged the gaming chip into his console, put on his VR headset, and declared his intention to play for only 8 hours, taking it easy for the day. He was then struck by a sudden realization, wondering if he was in the game. He thought it wasn't a real beginning if he didn't wake up in a bed. But then, he was confused by the character he had become. Suddenly, a voice called out to him, asking if he was still sleeping and telling him to hurry up because they were busy today. Zhu Engong was in awe, noting that the graphics were insane and that it was like real life. The ogre who had called out to him seemed confused and asked what he meant by, quote, graphics. Zhu Engong was surprised and wondered if he could talk to the characters, as he hadn't seen anything like that in the ads. He then hesitantly asked the ogre for his name. The ogre, who was named Karak, responded, asking him if he had already forgotten. He then turned and began to walk away, telling the Prince Shutra to hurry, as everyone was waiting for him. Zhou Engong was in a state of confusion, trying to process the fact that he was apparently Shutra Ignis, the Demon King's 9th son. He hadn't even had the chance to select a character. Thinking this should open his status window, he waved his hand, and it appeared. He wondered if he was required to play as Shutra for the first run, and he also noted how weak his stats were for a prince. Looking at his skills, he found a couple of weird ones: Conquest LVI and Protagonist Settings Adjustment LV1. He was perplexed, particularly by the second skill, and he wondered if it meant what he thought it did. Karak called out to him again, urging him to come out. Zhu Engong agreed and slowly stepped out, seeing a few more ogres outside. He was surprised to his core. He addressed Karak, asking what was up with the atmosphere, saying it felt like they were in a war. Karak dismissed his comment, saying it was nonsense, and told him to get going. They had to eliminate the Scarlet Lightning bastards. Zhu Engong was in a daze. Was their first battle going to be against a group of orcs who had formed a military uprising? He questioned Karak about taking only 10 people to a war, but Karak reminded him that they had discussed this yesterday and it was only a patrol. Confused, Zhu Engong asked if he had indeed heard that, and Karak questioned if he had eaten something wrong yesterday, noting how strange he was acting. Despite his confusion, Zhu Engong opened his status window again and was pleased to see a mini-map. He decided to keep it up at all times, finding it much more convenient. On the map, he noticed a hidden path and wondered if it was an event. Karak had been considering the route ahead, thinking it would take forever to get to where they were going. So Zhu Engong said he knew a much faster route, and told everyone to follow him. They went through bushes and over mountains on a long journey. When they finally arrived in front of a door, everyone was clearly exhausted. Karak, breathing heavily, asked how he found the place, wondering if he was a mage. Zhu Engong, also breathing heavily, dismissed the idea. Karak noted that he looked really tired, and Zhu Engong admitted to himself that he didn't know a level 1 character would be so unfit. Zhu Engong then suggested they check if the door would open, but suddenly his body started to glow. A notification popped up that he had leveled up. He couldn't believe it. He had leveled up just from walking. Plus, all his stats went up by 2, and he had 2 extra points. It was insane. Karak then told him to hurry up, and Zhu Engong replied that he was coming. He thought to himself that he didn't know what might be in there, but at least he wasn't alone. More importantly, he looked at his Protagonist Setting Adjustment LV1 skill and saw a new description. The protagonist has plot armor. Deeper inside the cave, Karak mentioned that the dwarves must have dug it. Zhu Engong, surprised, said he thought they didn't have any dwarves. Karak said they used to exist, and Zhu Engong asked if they had all moved out of the demonic realm. Karak replied that he didn't know and had only heard about it. Suddenly, they spotted a gold mine. They had struck gold. Karak believed that the stupid dwarves must have left behind all their weapons, and he told everyone to take everything, even if it was heavy, laughing maniacally. Zhu Engong stood in front of the space, looking at the weapons, only to see notifications pop up. Your level is not sufficient, your strength is not sufficient, your magic is not sufficient. Pissed, he decided he would still take them anyway. He looked for a way to store them in his inventory and found that he just had to touch something and think about taking it. He then saw something strange on his map and screamed for everyone to back off. Confused, they watched as the wall cracked and an explosion burst open, sending everyone to the ground. A group of red goblins appeared, and their general, Kai-chan, stated that they knew they would come this way and told them to kill them all. A brawl immediately erupted, and bodies began to pile up. Ju and Gong stared at the chaos, wondering what he should do. He thought he should at least steal their kills to get the express, still basically treating it as a game. He lashed out with an attack, but his sword shattered instantly upon hitting a goblin. The goblin glared at him, and Ju and Gong, scared to his core, began to run. The goblin chased him, and he tripped and fell, watching his HP gauge drop tremendously. The goblin caught up to him and was about to deal the final blow. Ju and Gong screamed like a baby, but then Karak came to the rescue, acting as a shield. Karak told the prince to move. Ju and Gong's hands were still shaking. He told himself it was just a game. He then stated that he couldn't do this, and that he'd had enough for today. He opened a screen that asked if he wanted to go to the menu, thinking that it was way too real and scary. He looked at his skills and saw a shocking message. You do not own any skills yet. He glared at the screen in shock as he realized that there was no option to end the game. He wondered if he was trapped in here. In the distance, the goblin sighted him and used magic to launch rocks at him. All Ju and Gong could think was that he couldn't die here. The rocks hit him and he fell to the ground, barely able to breathe. He watched the goblin run toward him to deal the last attack. It was bad. His HP dropped to the last bar upon impact and he died. Ju and Gong awoke in a dark, confined space. He wondered where he was, convinced that the orcs had taken him down. He mentally panicked, asking himself if this was what it felt like to be dead. Suddenly, a bright light appeared before him, and a beautiful lady spoke. She told him that he was a fated existence, and his mission was to conquer, enslave, and then rule. He was utterly confused, as that was the only instruction he received. The scene returned to a battlefield filled with red goblins and ogres fighting fiercely. Their leader slowly walked forward and remarked that the enemy was either ignorant or stupid to come with such a small force. He ordered his troops not to waste any time and to kill them all. Just then, Ingong woke up, rising from his supposedly dead state. The Red Goblin's leader was shocked, wondering what had just happened and if it was an awakening. He couldn't believe Ingong was still alive. A notification popped up, informing Ingong that he had learned the skill of telekinesis. He was flabbergasted, wondering how and when he had acquired the ability. As he heard the Red Goblin's thoughts, he realized he had acquired a subclass, Knight of Conquest. The Goblin leader screamed at his troops, commanding them to kill the bastard at once. Just then, Karak spotted the prince, and yelled for everyone to protect him, saying the prince must not be harmed. The troops immediately rushed to surround Ingong. He, in turn, pondered his new subclass. He knew Knight of Conquest was not a standard knight class, so he couldn't understand why he had it. It felt oddly familiar, as if he had always known it, and spells kept echoing in his head. Suddenly, his body moved on its own, and he slammed his sword into the ground. A voice echoed in his head, declaring that the power of conquest was the power of a king. A surge of energy entered the ogres in front of him. A new notification appeared. Conquest skill, under the king's banner LV1, which provided buff effects to allies within a designated area. The ogres roared, feeling their strength overflowing, and began a fierce counterattack, sweeping through the enemy. The red goblins were confused, wondering what happened and glaring at Ingong, thinking it must have been him. The leader attempted to attack Ingong and told him to stop, but Karak intervened, blocking the attack. Karak then dashed forward, slicing through the goblin leader in an instant. The goblins panicked when they saw their boss's head on the ground and began to run away. Ingong's troops yelled for them not to let a single one escape. Ingong received a series of notifications, stating that the general's merits were for his king, and that he had leveled up multiple times. He stared at his stats, bewildered by his level increase. Karak stood behind him, also confused, wondering what exactly this power was and if it was because of the prince. Later, back at the base, Ingong sat in his camp, panicking because he couldn't find a logout button. He tried to calm himself, thinking of two possibilities. The first was that he was trapped in a virtual reality and a critical bug had occurred, which would be fixed with an update. The second possibility, which he admitted sounded insane, was that this was reality, not a game. Like a character in a novel, he had entered the world of the game, or at least a world that resembled it. He observed the realistic background and the NPCs who could hold a conversation, noting that there was no mosaic censorship, a detail that seemed to prove his hypothesis more than anything. He wondered if this was a new world, and if he was destined to die there, then quickly dismissed the thought. He tried to stay positive, grateful that he wasn't an orc and that he was a prince, which meant he was born with a golden spoon. Karak then stepped in and asked the prince for some time. They went outside, and Ingong asked why Karak was suddenly demanding a sparring match. Karak explained that since Ingong would be their leader, knowing his swordsmanship would help them prepare for the future. Ingong, perhaps a little too confident, asked if it was really necessary, but Karak handed him a sword anyway. Karak told him not to worry, and that he would hold back. Ingong chuckled at Karak's casual words, and told him to be serious. Ingong dashed toward him and struck Karak, but it was like a small stone hitting a boulder. Karak easily hit him away, and Ingong fell to the ground with a grunt. Karak asked if he was alright, and Ingong complained that Karak shouldn't have hit him so hard. Suddenly, a notification appeared. Basic Swordsmanship LV1 had been acquired. Ingong was shocked, wondering when he had acquired it. He then realized it was just like with telekinesis, and he wondered if he acquired skills whenever he was directly attacked. Karak told him to end the sparring match and go eat, but Ingong, now more confident, said it was far from over. He said he was just getting started. Ju Ingong steadied himself and dashed towards Karak, their swords clanking. Karak felt that Ju Ingong's movements had become much better, a thought that made him wonder why the prince had been so terrible at the beginning of their fight. It wasn't as if his skills could have suddenly improved. Karak waved his sword, pushing Ju Ingong away. Though he landed safely, Ju Ingong immediately reported that his attack wasn't bad, was it? He then asked Karak what his level was. Karak answered that the last time he had checked, he thought he was at level 21. 21? Ju Ingong pulled up his screen, a smug grin forming on his face. The screen showed his level as 7, but he didn't feel the need to mention that. He simply stated that he should be able to catch up soon enough. The people in this world all had levels, but unlike him, they couldn't check their levels in a status window. Instead, they had to use a level evaluation spell. Ju Ingong considered that being able to see all his stats and reinforce them with extra points was a great advantage. He jumped once more to continue the attack, a power that clashed with Karak's. As their swords clanged, he thought to himself that he could become stronger. No, he could become stronger much faster than others. The scene shifted. The Demon Arc of Night saga followed the story of Zephyr, and how he surpassed his siblings to become the Demon King. There were many episodes until the ending, but the most important one occurred in the year 517. It was when Zephyr killed all his siblings to achieve his goal. That meant that the protagonist he was playing as would also be killed. Ju Ingong sat there, glaring at his screen in thought. The current year was 512. He still had some time before that event, and he needed to prioritize preventing it. The best way would be to become stronger than Zephyr. Suddenly, Karak called out to him, asking what he was doing and what he was even doing here, as he had been looking for him everywhere. Ju Ingong was surprised and asked if something had happened. Karak reminded him that there was a meeting today, and Karak told him to hurry because everyone was waiting. He didn't respond but agreed and followed him. Later, within the camp, Ju Ingong sat between two people. They reported that he was early. One of them asked him why he was suddenly so polite and told him to get comfortable because they were siblings. This was the 7th prince, Chris Moonlight. The lady beside him, the 8th princess Caitlin Moonlight, added that it was their first time meeting. Chris Moonlight assured him that it was all right and told him to just call them by their names. Ju Ingong responded that it was okay. He thought about how these two were the children of Elaine Moonlight, the 4th queen. They had been a real pain in the ass in the game, a delightful tidbit for him to remember. However, he recalled that a year before the day of the massacre, they both died at the hands of Zephyr and the Demon King's other children. The reason for their death, he knew, was the secret of Caitlin Moonlight. She was actually a bastard daughter. Caitlin reported that he had not followed the plan and had fought those guys on his own, even though she had told him to just go on patrol. Ju Ingong replied that he didn't know they would come from there. She stood up and grabbed him by the shoulder, offering to take a look at him. She reminded him that he was the weakest of all of them and should have been careful. Ju Ingong apologized, internally wondering why she was worried about him. Since when were the Demon King's children this close? Chris added that he was in for a real scolding if he did something dangerous again. Ju Ingong responded, internally pondering if they were actually kind. He considered that there were a lot of aura users among the lycanthropes, perhaps due to their life force. He wondered if he could learn aura just as easily using the same method he had used to get other skills. Ju Ingong stated that he had a favor to ask. Chris responded with a confused, huh? And Ju Ingong then asked a favor that was not so clear, causing the entire aura in the room to become tense. The scene then took a bizarre turn, shifting to a different space where some red goblins were fighting in a war against ogres. It was a vicious war, and people were slashing and screaming and hammering at each other. A short goblin sliced at a red ogre, who glared at him. The short goblin was almost killed with fear before the ogre smashed him into pieces. The ogre screamed for everyone to kill them all, stating that he would reward the one who got the most kills. The ogres roared, continuing the vicious war. The scene then returned to the dark space where Ju Ingong had been earlier. He was once again confused as he stared at a beautiful lady who had 2 different eye colors. He tried to speak, but the words were lost. He then looked to the side and saw some other figures. He asked who they were, and he wondered why he didn't recall these characters in Night Saga. A bright light shone on his face once more, and he woke up. He wondered if he had just dreamt, but to his shock, Karak was behind him, asking if he was up. Ju and Gong screamed that Karak had scared him. Karak, walking away, stated that he seemed fine. He then asked why Ju and Gong had asked the princess to hit him, saying that he had kept whining and look where it got him. Suddenly, Ju and Gong's body began to glow, and a notification arrived, stating that he had acquired Aura Level 1. He felt it, he felt the aura. Karak was shocked and asked if it was possible to awaken an aura if you got hit with it. Ju and Gong responded that it was somewhat possible. Karak then asked if that was why he had been suddenly full of energy when fighting the Lightning Tribe. Ju and Gong responded, "Yeah, that was me." "Oh, I see," Karak said. Ju and Gong then asked if anything had happened while he was sleeping. Karak responded that of course something had happened. The main force had won against the Lightning Tribe too. Ju and Gong was surprised. He had thought that Chris, Caitlin, and he were the only ones there to take down the Scarlet Lightning Tribe. Karak responded that there was no way, asking if he knew how big that tribe was. Ju and Gong then asked who had been in charge. Karak responded that General Bandal had been in charge, one of the strongest guys out there. Ju and Gong's thoughts continued. He recalled that General Bandal became Zephyr's subordinate in the year 515. He wasn't Zephyr's subordinate yet, which meant Ju and Gong could take him for himself first. He knew all there was to know about him, the rewards he liked to receive, the food he liked, his talents. But the most important part when bringing him to your side was to defeat him in a duel. Ju and Gong concluded that he should be able to take Bandal as his subordinate before Zephyr. It was worth trying. He still had a lot of time. "First, Bandal, you are going to be my subordinate," he said this, smiling ominously and planning for the future. In Caitlin's camp, a loud voice echoed. Chris was shocked, mentioning that Ju and Gong had reached the first level of aura explosion in just a day. And Gong responded that it was a given, as he had put all his points into aura, thinking to himself that it wasn't a rushed decision either. Aura moves generally improved one's physical capabilities, which was better than having telekinesis. Chris mentioned that that was impossible, asking him if it was because he was a Gandharva. He then called out to Ingong by his native in-game name, Shutra, asking if he could make an underground map too. Ingong asked what that was, wondering that he couldn't, but did have his mini-map. Chris responded that that was simple, and asked to borrow a pen and paper. After a while, Ingong drew a map. Chris was surprised, saying that it was more detailed than his own map. Ingong thought that it couldn't be more detailed than the one he had. Chris laughed, calling him a genius. Caitlin mentioned that since the guys in the Scarlet Lightning Tribe they had come across were all dead. The guys coming didn't know they knew about the underground tunnels. Chris responded that they should be able to ambush them if they utilized this, and then mentioned that there was something else he needed Ingong to do. A while later, Ingong was walking side by side with the goblins. Karak mentioned that their mission was to patrol the area again. Ingong responded that he had no choice, as he was the youngest of the siblings. Karak responded that it was a good thing they had reinforcements, and that it was all thanks to their hard work. Ingong then spotted 2 people in front of them, his sister and the mysterious other lady. He asked his sister about her robe, and she shushed him, mentioning that she was following him in secret just in case something happened. She said she would only step in if things were really dangerous, since it needed to be his accomplishment. Ingong thought to himself that his sister was going to support him like that, and wondered if she was stupid before laughing and agreeing. The other lady mentioned that she was Sarah, the adjutant, and that it was nice to meet him. Ingong responded that it was nice to meet her too. Sarah mentioned that they would keep up and he shouldn't worry about them, and they continued on. They continued into a cave where they spotted some chests. They wondered why all the caverns were empty, and assumed the dwarves had taken all their valuables when they moved. Ingong then asked what about the weapons they had gotten last time. Karak mentioned that he guessed they weren't considered valuable. As they continued inward, Karak mentioned that he thought something was coming their way. Ingong responded that he heard it too, checking his map and spotting a multitude of people coming their way. He concluded that it must be them. He then called for his inventory, looking at the potion there, and thinking that he had taken this flash spell item just in case this happened. He brought it out and told everyone to close their eyes when he gave the signal. Karak was confused, but did not question it. Suddenly, just in front of them, some eyes began to glare, and spiders walked out through the tunnel. They were stone spiders, monsters that often appear in caves. They were also always in groups of dozens, and possessed a very strong presence, and had a strong paralysis poison. "Close your eyes," Ingong screamed, and everyone closed their eyes as he tossed the bottle ahead. The bottle shattered, and a bright light shimmered, blinding all the insects in front of him. He thought to himself that stone spiders were rendered useless if they were exposed to light because they lived in the dark. Ngong then shouted for everyone to attack and kill the spiders, and the ogres immediately dashed in, roaring ominously. They slaughtered the spiders in what was almost an uneven march. Ngong stood behind them, watching. He checked the map, noticing that stone spiders hunt in groups and that groups are born to have a leader. He called out to Karak, asking him to follow him, saying that they would go to the boss. Karak followed him, and they ran through the space. On getting inside, a massive creature with multiple eyes roared at them. Karak jumped up and attempted to slash it with his axe, but it dealt no damage. He was shocked, thinking that the exterior was so hard. Ngong said that he had forgotten, and that the axe wouldn't pierce its exoskeleton. He thought that its weakness was fire, but he couldn't use fire-type magic here. The creature roared fiercely. Ngong then shouted to Karak, asking him to use fire and that it was weak to fire. Karak responded by asking where he was supposed to get fire. Someone then called out to Ngong, telling him to raise his sword, and he did just that. Suddenly, his sword burst into flames, and he was shocked. Looking back, he saw that his sister was the one that had infused fire magic into his sword. The creature was about to attack Ngong, but he steadied himself. He dashed forward, and using the burning blade, he sliced through the giant creature. Ngong watched as the giant spider, now a pile of burning embers, flickered out. Suddenly, his body began to glow, and a notification appeared before his eyes, announcing he had leveled up. Not once, but twice. The man was now a whopping level 9. His sister, Caitlin Moonlight, called out to him, asking if he was alright. She wondered what that sudden flash of light was. Ngong, being the smooth operator he was, casually brushed it off. He said it was a blessing, and not to worry since it happened sometimes. A blessing? Caitlin asked, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. From Grandava? Oh yeah, from Grandava. More importantly, Caitlin asked if he had ever fought creatures like that before. She mentioned his movements were pretty skillful. Ngong's response was a little shaky, as he claimed he had only read about them in books. He thought to himself, of course he knew how they worked. He'd fought them 100 times in the game. Prince, look over there. Ngong's gaze followed Karak's paw. A massive, glaring door stood before them. Without a second thought, they all burst through it. Ngong, Karak, Caitlin. What is this? Ngong wondered, staring into the space. He thought it looked like a town portal. Karak asked if he knew what it was. Ngong said he didn't exactly, but he had a guess. He mused that he wasn't sure, but the patterns looked dwarven. When he played as Zareth, he never got to see one of these, but as a hero, he saw it a few times. He thought if you injected mana, it would activate. So, with a smug grin, he walked up to it and stared at it. He then turned back to Caitlin and said he thought it might be a portal. Judging from the design, it did seem like a portal. Caitlin then asked if they could find out where it was connected to. Her colleague responded by saying if they searched nearby, there should be some inscriptions. Karak pointed something out on the wall nearby. Prince, over here, he barked. I think there are letters carved on the wall. They all walked over, noticing some inscriptions. It was obviously not a demonic script. It looked like dwarven characters. Karak asked if Caitlin could read it. Caitlin snarkily responded by asking why she would know dwarven scripts. Ngong began to speak. Gash, Car, Mountains, Portal number 3. The man was reading the script as if he was a dwarven from birth. Wait, what? How am I able to read dwarven? Asterisk, he thought to himself, completely shocked. Just as the existential crisis began, a notification appeared, stating he had acquired, quote, Dwarven language, level 1. Karak asked if he could actually read that. Yeah, I think so, Ngong replied with a newfound sense of superiority. Since when could you read dwarven? Caitlin asked. She then asked what it said below. He continued, I think it says if you infuse mana, it will activate. He turned back to her and asked if she could inject a little mana there. Why me? Why don't you do it yourself? Caitlin asked. Well, I'm still clumsy with it, Ngong said playfully, thinking to himself that he couldn't use mana at all, actually. Fine, she responded, rolling her eyes. She walked back and infused mana into the orb. It glowed, and a bright light engulfed the space. A map of the mountain range appeared in front of them. Everyone was shocked, their mouths and eyes wide open. This is the Gashka Mountains, one of them said. This dot is our current location, and portal number 3 should be here. Then that means there are dwarven tunnels over there too. Isn't that a good thing? Karak said. Later, at the camp, Chris was already ecstatic. To think there was a portal in such a place. He smacked Ngong on the back and told him he was truly a blessing. If there's anything you want, just say it, he offered. As long as it's something I can do, I'll grant it. I'm fine, Ngong responded, ever so humble. No, Chris insisted. As your leader and someone who is older, I want to reward you. If you refuse, my feelings will be hurt. In-gong paused and thought about it. Is it okay, even if it's a bit unreasonable? He asked. Chris was surprised and said he was now even more curious. Can you teach me the Beast God Fist art? Chris was taken aback by the request. In-gong thought to himself that he couldn't build weapons properly yet because of his level, but techniques were different. The Beast God Fist art was a martial art passed down through the lycanthrope royal family. In short, it was a powerful S-rank martial art. He knew it was a pretty ridiculous request, and he would understand if he refused. It might be difficult, right? It's okay. I figured from the start it wouldn't be possible, In-gong said, trying to be a good sport about it. Chris took a brief pause and then said, All right, I'll teach you. In-gong was shocked. Chris mentioned that he couldn't teach him the secret techniques, but he would teach him the aura. He asked if that was a good enough gift. In-gong was happy with it. Chris then looked at Caitlin, asking why she wasn't saying anything and if she didn't like the idea. She didn't respond. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Chris then said that from now on he could think of him as his brother. Brother. That's a pretty meaningful word, In-gong thought, not disliking the idea at all. In fact, he rather liked it. Yeah, he said, shaking on their words. They smiled and gave a knowing stare at each other. Let's work together from now on, Chris said. In-gong then received a notification. Alliance established with Chris Moonlight and Caitlin Moonlight. Later that evening, in the Scarlet Lightning Tribe's encampment, the goblins were gathered. A goblin named William was talking to someone who was kneeling on the ground. You wouldn't have come here targeting this place from the start, he said. What brings you here? It was the 6th princess, Felicia Doomblade, who had been captured by the goblin tribe. Gazing at his character window, Joe In-gong looked at his own reflection. He mused on the irritating fact that while all his other stats went up by 2 with each level, his charisma only increased by a single point. He thought it was a bit of a raw deal, especially since in the original Night Saga game, charm and appearance were separate stats, but he supposed it made sense given how quickly he was progressing. He also figured that with his level 10 breakthrough coming up, he could at least expect one of his skills to improve, just like how Zephyr and Lush's unique abilities leveled up at that milestone. Just then, Karak's voice came from outside asking if he was ready. Yes, he replied, stepping out to meet his friend. Karak commented on his cheerful demeanor, wondering if something good had happened. Joe In-gong, in a slightly smug tone, said that nothing special was going on. He just had his priorities straight. Outside, a crowd of goblins stood waiting, glaring at them. All right, let's get going, Joe In-gong said to the group, completely unfazed. The scene shifted to a mountain range where ogres and wolfmen were clashing fiercely in front of a massive door. Joe In-gong, Karak, Chris Moonlight, Caitlin Moonlight, and her assistants had entered the area and were now standing before a wolfman. Chris asked if their investigation was complete. The wolfman confirmed that it was, explaining that the portal ahead was connected to the Eshkava of the Eshka mountain, and that it was functioning perfectly, a testament to Delvin craftsmanship. With a nod of satisfaction, Chris said they would proceed. He and the others then infused mana into an orb, and a portal shimmered into existence. Both Karak and Joe In-gong were taken aback. Joe In-gong felt a mix of disbelief and giddiness, thinking it was a truly amazing sight to behold. He followed his companions through the glowing gateway. On the other side, they found a massive encampment. Just as I expected, Chris said. He judged there to be around 5,000 troops and suggested their priority should be the supplies. The plan was to have General Bandal launch a frontal assault as a distraction, allowing their infiltration unit to burn the enemy's food stores from the rear. One of Caitlin's assistants, however, pointed out that the number of soldiers seemed oddly small, which Chris and the others quickly agreed on. They wondered where all the soldiers had gone, considering a battle might already be underway. Joe In-gong, looking around, spotted some figures high up in the mountains and said it looked like a skirmish was happening. Chris told Joe In-gong to focus his aura into his eyes to get a better view. Joe In-gong's enhanced vision showed him a battle taking place, and he marveled at his own heightened senses. Caitlin asked him who the other fighters were, and Chris was quick to mention that those were not General Bandal's men. They were not supposed to be fighting today. Joe In-gong announced that the other party was Dark Elves, pointing out their small stature and the fact that they were riding Dracos. Chris noted that they were in retreat. He questioned if their commander had fallen, as they were fleeing at an incredible speed. Karak, always a bit slow on the uptake, asked what was going on. Joe In-gong, meanwhile, wondered what the Dark Elves were doing in the camp in the first place. They established a connection with General Bandal through a virtual communicator. Bandal said that he had heard they found the dwarves' portal and praised Chris, who immediately corrected him, stating that it was the 9th prince, Joe In-gong, who had gotten lucky. Bandal, seemingly unbothered, said that this time, Joe In-gong would finally be rewarded properly at the Demon Castle. Chris asked Bandal about the small fight in front of the Lightning Tribe. The general said it was probably the Dark Elves, who had apparently decided to join the battle on their own. Chris asked if they weren't reinforcements from the Demon King's castle, but Bandol responded that it was hard to say. The general, a true killjoy, then mentioned a bigger issue. Bandol told them that the leader of the Dark Elves' independent unit had been captured by the Scarlet Lightning tribe. Chris was shocked, realizing that the reckless skirmish was because of this. The sixth princess, Felicia Doomblade, was the daughter of the third queen, Sylvia Doomblade, and the twin sister of the fifth prince, Sylvan Doomblade. In the game, Felicia and Sylvan both belonged to the faction of the fourth princess, Anastasia Necreon. Because of that, the protagonist always saw her as an enemy. It was a bizarre situation that she would show up here, especially as a prisoner. Ju and Gong considered that she was probably trying to claim credit for something and messed up. Chris spoke to General Bandol, asking if the Scarlet Lightning bastards even realized who the Dark Elf was. Bandol replied he didn't know, and that they had not been able to confirm her identity yet. Chris then asked what the plan was, to which Bandol responded they would save her if they could. When Chris asked about negotiations, Bandol mentioned that they could talk if the enemy made the first move, but he had no intention of bowing down first. Chris said he understood. Bandol said he would gather more information and contact Chris if anything happened. After the call ended, Chris mused that their oh-so-brilliant older sister had become a prisoner. Caitlin Moonlight, her sister, insisted they had to save her if she was still alive. Chris acknowledged that would be nice, but added it wouldn't be easy. He worried that if they tried to rescue her, they could end up suffering losses themselves. Caitlin, shocked, yelled that they would save her and had to, because she was their sister. Chris paused, then said he knew that, but seemed hesitant to act. Ju and Gong watched them both, silent, and thought to himself that it was odd how unconcerned Chris seemed about rescuing Felicia. Perhaps something had happened between the siblings. Later they all gathered around and Chris laid out the plan. When General Bandol lured the Scarlet Lightning tribe's main force away, they would strike the enemy encampment from behind. Chris planned to charge straight into the center of the base to cause as much chaos as he could. He told Caitlin and Ju and Gong that they would each lead their own squad to carry out the mission. Ju and Gong asked if the mission meant rescuing their sister. Chris confirmed it, saying they would first burn the food storage and armory before rescuing Felicia. He warned them to retreat immediately if the situation became too dangerous. Caitlin screamed, calling her brother's name in protest. Caitlin insisted that Felicia was family and asked how he could say such a thing. Chris stood firm, stating they couldn't allow Felicia's reckless actions to jeopardize the entire operation. A group of wolfmen and ogres gathered at a different location, chanting war banter and yelling to annihilate the Scarlet Lightning bastards. Chris stood among them, watching the enemy camp from a cliff. Suddenly, a large explosion erupted within the camp, and the ogres charged, led by their roaring general, who ordered his brothers to kill all the red goblins. Ju and Gong's forces waited in the rear. Karak asked Ju and Gong why they weren't moving yet, as the attack had already begun. Ju and Gong told him to wait for the signal. The fierce battle raged for a moment, and when the general was satisfied, he ordered his brothers to move out. This was the signal. Chris gave the order to get ready and move, telling them to carry out the mission exactly as planned. They all charged in, and the goblins trembled at the sight of them. Caitlin told Ju and Gong to be careful, and he told her the same. Ju and Gong checked his map, giving instructions to his teammates to head to the food storage. Just then, a red goblin tried to punch Karak, but Ju and Gong swiftly threw his dagger, ending the goblin's life and, in the process, gaining a new throwing skill. Karak asked the prince when he had learned how to throw daggers, and Ju and Gong simply said it was nothing special and they should move quickly. He offhandedly mentioned that he had just tossed a dagger the previous night and somehow gained the skill. Karak pointed out what looked like the food storage, asking if they should just set it on fire. Ju and Gong told him that was exactly the plan, but then he stopped, a thought striking him. What about Felicia? If she was locked up inside, she could get caught in the flames and die. He told Karak they had to find her first. Karak, in disbelief, asked how he expected to do that. Ju and Gong said to hold on. He checked his map, reasoning that Felicia should register as a neutral NPC, either blue or purple. This way, Karak, he shouted, and Karak replied he understood. They entered one of the tents, and Ju and Gong declared it had to be the place, but then asked where Felicia was. A voice called out, asking what Ju and Gong was doing there. It was the sixth princess, Felicia Doomblade. Felicia asked Ju and Gong what he was doing there, but he gave no answer. Instead, he simply told her to stay still, and that they could talk later. This place was dangerous, and he needed to untie her quickly so they could leave. He thought to himself that if he could get Felicia indebted to him here, it would be a useful tool for him later. She said nothing and just followed his lead, They barely escaped as they walked out of the tent. Ju and Gong told her to hurry so they could regroup with Chris and Caitlin. Felicia stopped him for a second and asked if Chris and Caitlin came to rescue her with him. Gong responded with a bit of a condescending tone, asking why she would even question that. Of course they came to rescue her. She was surprised by this. Felicia told Ju and Gong that he had been so far removed from the power struggles that he wouldn't know this. But before she could continue, Karak called out, telling them they don't have time. Ju and Gong suddenly dashed away, telling Felicia to come quickly. As she followed, she thought to herself, wait, when did he start calling me by my name? He was already gone, not giving her thoughts any attention. She followed, calling out, "Ah, behind you!" He asked what was going on, and a light suddenly struck him. He coughed up blood and immediately caught fire. The people around him shouted his name, terrified as they watched him burn. They were all scared as they watched the fire consume him. The goblin was thrilled and barked at Felicia. She turned to face it, but before she could act, a fireball burst on the goblin's face. She was shocked and looked to where the attack came from. She saw Ju and Gong standing there, holding a fire arrow. He had acquired a new skill, fire arrows, and he was smirking. With a joyful, almost unhinged laugh, he fired more arrows at the other goblins, and they took multiple hits. He thought it was incredible, even if it was only level 1. He was very pleased with himself. Suddenly, an ice arrow struck him from behind. She called out, asking if he was okay, but he just told her to wait and not come any closer. A flurry of ice arrows came flying in. The attack struck him once more, and when he stood up, he had acquired the ice arrows skill. He was happy because it was just as he had thought. However, he immediately fell to the ground as his health had dropped to 13. The arrow had pierced through his chest. If he took another hit, he would probably die. Felicia called out to him, "Idiot!" She stood there, glaring at him, and asked who told him to save her. He was surprised by this. She continued by saying that he was the weakest among their siblings, so who did he think needed saving? Ju and Gong thought to himself, wait, Felicia seems to be misunderstanding something. He glared, and she asked him when he had learned magic. He looked toward the archer who had fired the ice magic, noting that she had even taken down that mage just now. He suddenly understood. She was misunderstanding, thinking that he was trying to save her and not knowing that he wanted to take the attack so he could learn the new skill. Felicia then bent over and pulled the arrow from his chest. She used a skill on him, heal, and he was instantly healed. The wound sealed up, and just like that, he had acquired the level 1 heal technique. The wound healed instantly, as expected of the genius mage, Felicia Doomblade. Felicia then asked if he was feeling better and if he could stand up. He said he was fine and thanked her, feeling his blood replenish. A loud growl suddenly came from behind them, and they turned to see a massive goblin lunging toward them. What the hell is that? They wondered. Felicia said it was a blood goblin, one of the mutated species of goblins. She asked him what that meant for them, and he said that they had to get through that thing to escape, but they couldn't, so they turned around and ran away. Ju and Gong thought to himself about how they were supposed to fight that thing. Gong, never one to miss a moment to state the obvious, remarked on its surprising speed for such a massive creature. Felicia suggested a strategic delay, announcing her plan to use magic to blast it away. Gong, who clearly had a flair for the dramatic, felt a wave of shock, silently questioning how he was meant to buy time against a beast that big. The goblin, unimpressed by their bickering, smashed the ground again. The group jumped in a flurry of panic. Finally, Gong decided it was a good idea to put on a brave face, declaring he would somehow outgrow the situation, and told Felicia to get her magic ready. He called out to Carrick, asking where he was, and Carrick responded with an equally loud yell. Gong confidently stated they would execute the plan just as they had done last time, and they should get ready. He pulled it out, slamming it into the ground with a theatrical flourish. With a yell, he used his skill, and Carrick, feeling the power course through him, roared and leaped at the red goblin. The goblin was momentarily startled by the attack. Karak unleashed a flurry of blows, giving Felicia all the time she needed to prepare her magic. She flew to the goblin's back, her eyes narrowed in a cold glare. She unleashed her skill, launching the goblin into the air before slamming it back down to the ground. The goblin, now thoroughly disoriented, was stunned, giving Karak the space to deal a final blow that took the red goblin out instantly. With the battle over, Gong's protagonist settings had increased to level 10, much to his delight. Thanks to the effect of his level 2 settings, a new passive skill had been added. He stared at the screen and gleefully declared it was time to open his gift box. The skill, Battlefield Protection Level 1, was the classic Stormtrooper effect. For those unfamiliar with the term, it's the phenomenon where a barrage of projectiles mysteriously miss their target, a phenomenon everyone has seen at least once. With a skill like this, Gong could now replicate the ultimate protagonist plot armor, a concept so absurdly lucky it could only exist for him. Suddenly, the red goblins roared and dashed towards them, and Felicia, with a hint of exasperation, shouted to In-gong to do something, as the enemies were still swarming. They hadn't even had a chance to run. She turned back and hurled a magical attack at them, briefly pushing them away. In-gong watched her and smugly thought to himself that it looked like magic, but it was, in fact, a spirit. He knew that whether a dwarf or an elf was still an elf, and Felicia was no ordinary mage. She was a born spirit summoner. Then, with the kind of hope only he could muster, he wondered if he could somehow get hit by her attack and gain her skill for himself. A brilliant yellow flare suddenly burst above the group, and they all looked up in confusion. Karak, with a completely serious expression that was almost comical, said that they should all take off their clothes. The protagonist immediately understood that the yellow flare was the retreat command, and it looked like Karak was simply lost in translation. Karak asked what they should do, and requested an order from the prince. In-gong looked back at Karak, a bit hesitant, and said that he and the troops should fall back. He explained that he needed to go to Caitlin. Karak looked confused and asked what he meant, then immediately said that he would go with him. In-gong explained that there must be a reason for the retreat order, and instructed him to just do as he said for now. As Karak seemed to waver, Felicia walked in and declared that she would go with In-gong. She said she couldn't stand owing people and wanted to take the chance to repay her debt, adding that she still had business with those pigs. In-gong simply glared at her before Karak, still confused but dutiful, asked him to be careful. He promised they would be waiting above. In-gong said that he understood and would see them in a bit. As they walked away, Felicia asked him if he really needed to go to Caitlin. He responded that they never knew, and the sudden retreat order seemed suspicious. Felicia wondered aloud if Caitlin had been caught by guys like these. In-gong said that he had no thoughts on the matter and hoped not, so they could all go back together. Felicia told him that he seemed really worried about Caitlin, to which he replied that it was only natural since she was his sister. He then thought to himself that it was more because of their alliance, of course. Felicia seemed to glare at him, though she didn't see anything. The scene then shifted back to where the red ogres were charging. Caitlin was not just fine, she was a one-woman army, swiftly dashing and landing precise attacks on each of them, taking them out. She turned her back, and they all exploded in a rather theatrical display. The other ogres seemed undeterred and pushed forward, but she simply jumped out of the way, created a sword out of thin air, and sliced them apart. Just behind them, In-gong and Felicia stood there, looking thoroughly useless and quite puzzled. Felicia told them, with a hint of smugness, that it was just as she thought. Caitlin was perfectly okay. In-gong thought to himself that there was nothing to worry about after all. Caitlin then asked them why they hadn't retreated and why they were there. In-gong responded that he came to save her, or maybe to help her, and it looked like there was no need. Caitlin, in a tone that showed she was still confused, asked what he meant. She then spotted Felicia and dashed over to hug her, saying how glad she was that Felicia was safe. Felicia looked away, saying that of course she was safe and that Caitlin worried too much. In-gong had the audacity to smile at this display, thinking to himself that the two of them seemed quite close. He then checked his map, noticing that the enemies were circling back. He told them that they should retreat quickly. Caitlin agreed, telling him he needed to lead the way while they would cover the rear. The scene then jumped back to the ogres waiting at the portal. Felicia, along with In-gong and Caitlin, walked past and into the space. Felicia then asked Caitlin if it was true that In-gong had found the portal. Caitlin responded that yes, he had played a huge role in the operation. Felicia seemed impressed, commenting on how amazing that was and when he had changed so much. Just then, Chris called out to everyone, saying that it was good they had made it back safely. Caitlin said that she simply brought Felicia back. Felicia had nothing to say but walked toward Chris and told him it had been a while. Chris simply said that yes, it had been a while, Felicia. Later that evening, the four of them were in a secluded space. Chris said he heard that General Bandle's side had also won, and that Yakuza had apparently abandoned the fight after seeing their camp. In-gong, clueless as ever, asked who Yakuza was. Caitlin, with a sigh of sorts, explained that it was the name of the Scarlet Lightning Tribe's chief, and asked if he had forgotten already. Felicia asked Chris if he was saying that Yakuza had surrendered. Chris responded that not exactly. He seemed to have just run off somewhere else. He continued, explaining that if Yakuza gathered his scattered allies, he might still be able to fight a decent battle. Chris mentioned that that was why they would strike Kai-chin's older brother Kairam's forces tomorrow. He said that if Yakuza joined up with them, it would be a headache. Chris then turned to Felicia, asking what had brought her all this way. Felicia looked uncomfortable but said that she had been researching nearby ruins and was captured while on her way to help after hearing about the battle. Chris, with a skeptical look, asked her if that was the truth. She responded, asking if he thought she was lying. They glared at each other for a second, and then Chris turned away, saying that she had a rough time and they should leave it there for today. He then told everyone to rest. The others told him good work, but Felicia didn't say a word. The scene then cut back to the camp, where Gong was checking the inbox for his skills. He was very glad, though he said to himself that the only one useful in real combat right now was aura. Suddenly, Felicia's voice called out, asking if she could come in for a moment. He said no problem. She looked uncomfortable, but he asked her what brought her there at such an hour. She walked toward him, grabbed him, and, as he stood there in utter confusion, told him to take off his clothes. Ju and Gong felt utterly confused. He asked Felicia what she meant by that, and she just pointed at his clothes and backed away. She then asked if he wasn't going to let her heal him. Ju and Gong responded with a puzzled, "Huh?" He finally understood what she had intended, which made his previous question look a little silly. Felicia then explained that what she had done earlier was closer to first aid. She said she wanted to cast healing magic again because he might have sustained internal injuries. Ju and Gong thought to himself that she had definitely gotten him for a moment. Felicia then changed the subject, asking why his body gave off light earlier and if there was a problem. Ju and Gong nonchalantly told her it was nothing, and that it just happened sometimes. Felicia still sounded confused. Ju and Gong quickly changed the subject again, telling her that he had a more important request. When she wondered what it could be, he said it was something only she, Felicia, could do. She just gave him a suspicious glare for a moment. The scene then shifted to Ju and Gong, staring at the skills he had acquired from Felicia. It seemed he had asked her to touch him, the little rascal. Thanks to Felicia's willingness to listen to his request, he had learned 3 healing skills. On top of that, today was the day. He glanced at Caitlin, who told him that Beast Fist arts had many different branches. Ju and Gong thought to himself that he could finally get to learn Beast Fist arts. Caitlin then told him that she would let him learn the werewolf branch of Beast Fist arts. She explained that it was a martial art symbolic of the lycanthropes, and among them, the werewolves. Beast Fist art was considered the foundation of Beast God Fist arts, which was probably why Caitlin had decided to teach it to him. She then explained that Beast Fist art utilized both external and internal aura, and today she would teach him the basics of internal aura usage. Ju and Gong confirmed that he understood. Caitlin asked him to close his eyes and focus on his aura. He did as he was told, and for a moment, he actually felt it. The aura. The power of life. Aura, she had explained, was very close to the power of the soul, and when taken to the extreme, it became the power of the soul itself. When he opened his eyes, he received a notification. You have acquired passive skill, protagonist physique. He was shocked but continued reading. It said that this skill greatly increased the efficiency in training skills that were mastered physically. When the skill leveled up, the special trait of that level would unlock. He wondered if this protagonist physique was a broken skill too. It didn't fall short of Zephyr or Lucha's passive skills at all. He had acquired quite a number of skills, and the fact that the special traits unlocked by level meant that the system added entirely new functions as the level rose. He smirked, thinking to himself, so this is what it means to be the protagonist. How thrilling. Caitlin called out to Ju and Gong, asking him what on earth he had been doing all this time. She told him to concentrate. He apologized, and she said they should properly begin learning Beast Fist art. He replied that he was in her care. After he activated the skill, she said to him that it was actually very impressive that he was able to perform the basic movements of Beast Fist art so quickly and accurately. He stood there, silent, thinking that even while barehanded it felt like wielding a deadly weapon. So this was the Beast Fist art. Caitlin then said, "Alright, shall we move on to the next technique?" Suddenly, a wolfman called out to her, saying that something terrible had happened. The scene then moved to Chris, who told the others that Kyram's unit had vanished. They stood around a table and were surprised by the news. Chris continued, saying that it seemed Kyram had caught wind of something. They weren't sure what would happen, but they were sure they would find out what would happen in the end of their plan. Caitlin then asked what they were going to do. Chris said that according to General Bandal's intelligence, Yaksa and Kyram were expected to rendezvous there, and considering the terrain, the probability was quite high. Ju and Gong said, in that case we'll have to take a gamble. From that moment on, Chris said they had to join forces with General Bandal, along with the main army, who would enter a full-scale battle against the Scarlet Lightning Tribe. The scene then shifted to the Scarlet Lightning Tribe's subjugation army main base. General Bandal stood there, telling Prince Chris that he had done well to come all the way there. Prince Chris responded that he hadn't changed a bit, and that it had been a while. General Bandal replied in kind, adding that it had been a while for the princess as well, and asking how they all had been. Felicia responded, asking why her brother would ask such cheesy questions, and then asked how his subordinates were. He responded that they were all doing fine. Ju and Gong smirked as he glared at them. He thought to himself that the man he had favored most back in the Night Saga was actually General Bandal. Maybe that's why, even with that stern face, he felt strangely familiar. He walked up to him and extended his hand, saying, "Good to see you again, Bandal." General Bandal glared at him and just extended a finger, saying, "Yes, likewise, Prince." Just then, the spirit that had been speaking to Ju and Gong in his dreams appeared for a brief moment. After that, another spirit beside her also appeared, glaring at the prince. They were both glaring at each other. He was confused by this, but then the words conquest and war echoed just after that short dream. He immediately woke up, confused. He wondered if that was a dream. He had definitely seen that woman in a dream before, but he wondered who the other woman in red armor was. Karak then called out to the prince, telling him that they needed to go and that their departure was imminent. Ju and Gong understood, walking outside. He watched as the boogers were carrying supplies and going about their normal work. Ju and Gong was assigned to the left flank, Bandal to the center, while Chris and Caitlin commanded the right. The highly mobile Dark Elves acted as an independent detachment tasked with the raid. The march began, and time passed in the blink of an eye. When Ju and Gong finally came to his senses, he was already standing right in the middle of a battle surrounded by thousands. It was very uncomfortable because it seemed like everything was moving too fast. General Bandal roared the order to prepare for battle, telling everyone to teach the enemy the true meaning of pain. All the troops roared back, dashing in. The goblins stood ready, their leader smirking at their foolish charge. Suddenly, a wild explosion erupted behind the ogre forces. "What on earth?" General Bandal screamed, utterly confused. Then, to their utter surprise, a massive swamp mammoth appeared and shattered their formation in an instant, blowing ogres aside in a wave of chaotic destruction. Ju and Gong and Karak glared at the scene, completely baffled. The war was not going well for their team. The swamp mammoth, a monstrosity far more massive than a simple mammoth, glared at Ju and Gong. Just then, lizardmen joined the fight, and Ju and Gong's troop turned to face them. "Damn it," Chris Moonlight screamed, "so they knew all this time and were just toying with us." Caitlin Moonlight then called out to Chris, suggesting they retreat for now and look for another opportunity. If they failed to pull back, they might suffer even greater losses, perhaps even total annihilation. Caitlin said that if they kept going, the casualties would only continue to pile up. She insisted they had to make a decision, and that now was the time to retreat. He glared at her, having nothing to say. Then he screamed the order to all forces. The mages were to form a defense line at the rear and hold them off as long as possible, while the rest formed ranks and retreated. The war was a one-sided affair, with the lizardmen and goblins easily taking down the ogres and wolfmen. A lizardman then roared and leaped at Ju and Gong, but Karak, who seemed to be having none of it, slashed the creature from behind, making it fall to the ground. He then shouted at Ju and Gong, telling him to get a hold of himself and that a single wrong move would kill them all. Ju and Gong responded with an all right. He thought that Karak was right and that this was no longer a game. Chris was also doing his best to calm the situation, dashing around and hitting goblins. He screamed that everyone must survive and return alive, that they were not to die on him. The scene then took a change of pace to where some elves were healing the ogres. A very annoyed Chris said that this was his negligence and that he should have suspected something. General Bandal mentioned that it was already done, and their only option was to either withdraw completely or request for reinforcements from the Demon King's castle. A defeated-looking Chris said that was what they must do. He said he could not let his subordinates be dragged to their deaths just because of his pointless pride. Felicia then told them to wait, saying she just thought of something. She walked in and told them that the very reason she came to the area in the first place was to explore a ruin at the end of the Gishka Mountain. Ju and Gong thought that while Felicia may have been an outstanding mage, even in Night Saga she was not a combat-oriented character. Her traits were all about research and ruin investigation. Felicia continued, saying that for a long time she had been studying a ruin that was said to have existed within those mountains for 1,500 years, or rather, the lair of Enkidu, the Earth Dragon. Enkidu, a dragon born from magma, used numerous treasure guardians, including the dwarves that once lived in the Gishka Mountains, to protect his lair and hoard. Enkidu also bestowed weapons on them for this purpose. Felicia then said that the anvil that gives birth to thunder was a relic that not only allowed one to control the chimeras created to serve as treasure guardians, but also cast any skill magic. She then slammed her hand on the table, saying that if they wanted to win, their only option was to find it. Thanks for watching, guys. If you made it to the end, let's comment the protagonist's name for the series down below. Hope you remember it. See you on the next one.